At Sunday lunch, my sister's son pointed and said, "Mom says you're selfish." Everyone clapped. I smiled and said, "Then she won't miss the $7,000 I deposit for her every month." She froze mid-laugh, eyes wide. I, 34M, am a commercial real estate developer. I live a pretty quiet, boring life by most people's standards. I don't wear flashy designer clothes. I don't buy expensive watches. And I still drive a 6-year-old truck that has a dent in the rear bumper from where I backed into a loading dock. Most of my extended family assumes I do okay, maybe pulling a decent mid-level salary. But they have always, without a doubt, viewed my older sister as the absolute peak of success. My sister is 36. She is married to my brother-in-law, who is 38. They have an 8-year-old son, my nephew. For the last 3 years, my sister and brother-in-law have lived in a massive, sprawling 5-bedroom custom build in a highly exclusive, high-cost suburb. They constantly cycled through leased luxury SUVs, and they took semi-annual, heavily photographed vacations to expensive resorts in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Europe. The family narrative, pushed heavily by my mother and father, was always that my brother-in-law was a visionary genius. He had started a boutique tech logistics company that was supposedly always just on the verge of a massive, multi-million-dollar buyout from a major competitor. My sister, meanwhile, was touted as a brilliant freelance consultant who somehow managed to balance raising a child and maintaining a high-powered career perfectly, while still having time to host lavish wine-tasting nights. What my parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins didn't know was that 3 years ago, the illusion almost shattered. My brother-in-law came to my house late one Tuesday night, practically in tears. His startup had supposedly hit a massive, insurmountable wall. He sat on my living room couch, completely defeated, claiming that his primary angel investors had suddenly pulled out due to shifting market conditions. He said they were drowning in operating costs and were literally weeks away from having their custom home foreclosed on. My sister called me the very next morning. She was sobbing uncontrollably into the phone. She told me the stress of the impending bankruptcy was causing her severe, undiagnosed neurological issues. She claimed she was having tremors and migraines that required entirely out-of-pocket specialists because their insurance was tied up in the failing business. She begged me, leveraging every ounce of our shared childhood, to help them bridge the gap until their supposed big buyout went through. I am not a heartless person, and despite her lifelong tendency to be the center of attention, she is my sister. I agreed to help, but I am also a businessman. I don't just hand out cash blindly. We sat down and drew up a formal, legally binding investment contract. I agreed to inject exactly $7,000 a month into his corporate LLC account to keep his business operations afloat and cover their massive mortgage overhead. In exchange, I would receive a 15% equity stake in the company once the inevitable buyout happened, plus a full repayment of the principal amount I loaned them. To me, it was a high-risk family venture capital loan. I had my attorney draft the paperwork. We all signed it, and it was notarized. I set up an automated wire transfer from one of my secondary business, holding accounts directly into their designated corporate operating account. For 3 entire years, that money transferred on the first of every single month. 36 months. $252,000 in total liquid cash. For 3 years, I received quarterly single-page spreadsheet reports from my brother-in-law showing high logistics overhead, server costs, and payroll, keeping the ruse alive. It all blew up spectacularly on a Sunday. Every first Sunday of the month, my mother and father host a large, mandatory family lunch at their house. The whole extended family attends. We're talking aunts, uncles, older cousins, spouses. Usually around 20 to 25 people crowded around extended dining tables in my parents' sunroom. We were sitting around the tables, finishing up the main course. My sister was, as usual, holding court. She was complaining loudly to an aunt about the supposedly terrible service at a 5-star resort they had just returned from in Cabo. "It's just impossible to find good help these days," my sister said, waving her fork dramatically in the air. "They act like you're bothering them when you ask for fresh towels. And honestly, the taxes in the state are draining us dry. It's so incredibly hard for self-made people like us to get ahead when everyone else just expects handouts." She looked directly across the table at me, when she heavily emphasized the word handouts. A bit of context. Earlier that week, I had politely declined to contribute to a $5,000 family luxury vacation fund that my mother was trying to put together for my parents' upcoming anniversary trip. I had simply explained that I was tying up my available liquid capital in a massive new commercial zoning project and couldn't comfortably drop a few thousand on a cruise right then. My sister had caught wind of this and had been making passive-aggressive, snippy remarks about my priorities all afternoon. Some people, my sister continued, her voice rising slightly so the chatter at the other end of the table died down, just hoard their money. They sit on it like dragons. They don't care about creating family experiences or helping out. They just care about themselves. Right, buddy? She smiled warmly and nudged my nephew, who was sitting next to her playing on an expensive tablet. My nephew, who is 8 years old and clearly just repeats exactly the conversations he hears his parents having behind closed doors, dropped his tablet, looked up, and pointed his little finger directly across the table at me. "Mom says you're selfish," he announced loudly. The entire sunroom went dead silent for a split second. You could hear the ice shifting in someone's water glass. Then my brother-in-law chuckled, a slow, arrogant chuckle. A few of the older aunts and uncles, who had bought entirely into the false narrative that I was a tight-fisted, greedy bachelor who refused to chip in a few bucks for my parents' anniversary, joined in. Someone at the far end of the table started a slow, mocking clap, which actually quickly turned into a genuine round of applause and laughter from half the family, validating the cute but honest thing my nephew had just blurted out. I looked at my sister. She was beaming. She looked incredibly smug. Triumphant, even. She was soaking in the validation of the room, looking down her nose at her boring, truck-driving little brother. I didn't lose my temper. I didn't raise my voice or slam my hands on the table. I just casually pushed my plate back, leaned forward, rested my elbows on the polished wood, and looked directly into her eyes. Well, I said clearly, making sure my voice carried over the dying applause. Then she won't miss the $7,000 I deposit for her every month. The silence that slammed into that room was absolute. It was suffocating. My sister froze mid-laugh. Her mouth was physically hanging open. Her eyes went incredibly wide, pupils blown out, the color completely, instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like she had just stepped off a ledge into thin air. My brother-in-law actually dropped his fork. It hit his porcelain plate with a sharp, loud crack that echoed in the quiet room. "What are you talking about?" my father demanded, his voice breaking the tension, looking frantically back and forth between me and my sister. Just what I said, I replied, keeping my eyes locked dead on my sister, watching her hyperventilate slightly. For 3 years, I've been keeping their lights on, paying their mortgage, funding that startup. But since I'm so utterly selfish and just hoard my money, I'll go ahead and stop right now. Excuse me. I stood up, pushed my chair in neatly, walked out the front door, got into my dented truck, and drove home in total silence. By the time I pulled into my driveway 30 minutes later, my phone was basically melting. I had 27 missed calls from my sister, 14 from my brother-in-law, and 6 from my mother. I ignored every single one of them. I walked directly into my home office, opened my laptop, logged into my secure commercial bank portal, navigated to the recurring wire transfers, and clicked the cancel button on the $7,000 payment schedule for the very next morning, the first of the month. The next few weeks were an absolute masterclass in extreme entitlement, manipulation, and gaslighting. My sister went on a massive, scorched-earth offensive campaign within the family. She somehow convinced my mother, father, and the gossiping aunts that the $7,000 a month was actually just guaranteed returns on investments from a complex business deal that I had aggressively forced them into years ago, and that by cutting it off, I was illegally and maliciously withholding their own hard-earned money to ruin them. My father called me, absolutely furious, practically yelling into the receiver, demanding I honor my commitments to my family. I stayed calm. I told him to go to their house and asked to see their actual bank statements and the contract we signed. He refused, claiming he trusted his daughter and didn't need to pry into their private finances, and that I was tearing the family apart over simple greed. Then, the dirty tricks and the threats started. On the 5th of the month, The reality of having no cash flow hit them. I received a frantic, highly aggressive email from my brother-in-law. Because my wire transfer hadn't cleared, their massive auto drafts for their custom home mortgage and their luxury car leases were bouncing. He threatened to sue me for breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and demanded I immediately back pay the month with a late fee. I didn't reply to him. I forwarded the email directly to my attorney, a ruthless, methodical guy named Dave, asking him to carefully review the original agreement we had signed 3 years ago. Dave called me a few hours later. He pointed out a very specific, crucial clause he had baked into the original contract. My continuous funding was strictly contingent on receiving accurate, truthful quarterly financial statements regarding the startup's operating capital. I decided it was time to actually verify those simple one-page spreadsheets my brother-in-law had been sending me. I didn't just want a glance. I wanted a deep dive. I authorized Dave to hire a forensic accounting firm and a licensed private investigator to do a full workup on my brother-in-law's LLC. What they uncovered over the next 3 grueling weeks changed the entire trajectory of the situation from a family dispute into a massive fraud case. The PI and the accountants pulled the state registry records. My brother-in-law's tech logistics startup hadn't just hit a wall. It had been legally, quietly dissolved exactly 8 months after I signed the funding agreement. So, where the hell had my money been going for the last 28 months? The forensic accountants tracked the bank routing numbers. The corporate account I was religiously wiring my $7,000 into every month had been quietly converted into a generic holding account. That holding account funneled money directly into a brand new LLC, which was entirely owned and operated by my sister and brother-in-law. This new LLC didn't do logistics. It didn't do tech. It had one single purpose: buying and managing residential real estate. They had taken my monthly $7,000, combined it with whatever my sister was making from her consulting gig, and used it as guaranteed income to qualify for commercial mortgages on 3 separate, very lucrative duplex properties in a rapidly growing neighboring college town. The one-page spreadsheets my brother-in-law had been faithfully emailing me for years were complete, utter fabrications. The massive logistics overhead, the server maintenance costs, the contractor payroll. It was all a lie. Those numbers perfectly matched property taxes, the maintenance fees, and the commercial mortgage payments on their secret real estate portfolio. They were collecting steep rent from 12 different college students across 6 units, living a life of absolute luxury entirely off that rental income, and actively using my $7,000 a month to build their personal multi-million-dollar equity empire, while looking me in the eye at family dinners and claiming they were starving. I was livid. I instructed Dave to prepare a massive civil lawsuit. But before we could even file the initial paperwork with the county clerk, my sister and brother-in-law decided to escalate the situation to a level I didn't think they were capable of. My sister, finally realizing that the money tap was permanently welded shut and their entire house of cards was about to collapse, took a drastic, unhinged step. She went down to the county courthouse and filed an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order against me. In her sworn, signed affidavit, she claimed that I had come to her house in the middle of the night, physically cornered her on her porch, threatened her life in front of her young son, and promised completely financially ruin her and put her on the street if she didn't illegally sign her primary home over to me. It was a blatant, highly calculated lie designed to force me to the negotiating table. She knew that in my line of work, dealing with commercial zoning boards and city councils, a permanent restraining order for violence could trigger morals clauses and completely nuke my real estate licenses. But she severely underestimated how paranoid a single guy living alone with expensive tools and hardware on his property can be. I have a highly advanced, outward-facing 4K security system covering every inch of my property. Furthermore, I have a hardwired GPS tracker on my truck installed by my commercial insurance provider to lower my fleet premiums. In the United States, an ex parte temporary restraining order can sometimes be granted the same day based just on the applicant's word, but a mandatory hearing with a judge to make a permanent order usually happens within roughly 14 days. We went to the permanent TRO hearing. Her lawyer, a sleazy guy who clearly hadn't vetted his client's story, stood up and presented her tearful, incredibly dramatic, fabricated testimony. My sister actually cried real tears on the stand, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the terrified victim perfectly. When it was our turn, Dave didn't even call me to the stand. He simply approached the bench and handed the judge a bound folder. It contained the certified GPS logs from my insurance company proving my truck was parked in a municipal lot 60 miles away on the exact date and time she claimed I was at her house. He then handed over a USB drive containing my home security footage showing me leaving my house hours prior, and finally, a certified timestamp video from a local city council's public access feed showing me standing at a podium actively arguing about commercial drainage variances at the exact moment she swore under penalty of perjury that I was screaming at her on her front lawn. The judge, a stern woman with zero patience for family court drama, reviewed the evidence in absolute silence for about 3 minutes. You could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. The judge looked up, locked eyes with my sister, and dismissed the petition immediately with prejudice. She then delivered a blistering 10-minute lecture to my sister about the severe criminal penalties for perjury and filing false police reports, explicitly stating on the official court record that my sister's testimony was complete malicious fabrication. My sister stormed out of the courtroom, her face flushed dark red, refusing to even glance in my direction. The total failure of the TRO made them incredibly desperate. The mortgages on the 3 duplexes in their massive custom home were all coming due, and they were completely over-leveraged. 2 days later, my brother-in-law crossed a legal line he could never, ever uncross. I received an urgent red flag alert from my premium credit monitoring service. A hard inquiry had just been made for a $150,000 home equity line of credit. The application was attached to one of their hidden duplex properties, but used my full legal name, my social security number, my pristine financial history, and listed me as a primary financial guarantor. My brother-in-law, knowing my social security number and personal details from our previous legitimate business filings, had digitally forged my signature on federal bank loan documents. He was desperately trying to leverage their hidden rental property to pull out a massive lump sum of cash to replace the monthly income when it cut off, and he was using my credit to secure it because his own credit was rapidly tanking from the missed auto drafts. He clearly didn't realize that in the United States, committing wire fraud and forging signatures on high-value bank loan documents across state lines. The bank processing the loan was headquartered in Delaware, instantly elevates a petty family dispute into a very serious federal and state felony issue. I didn't call him. I didn't text my parents to warn them. I didn't say a word to anyone in the family. I drove straight to the local precinct and filed a massive police report for identity theft and fraud. I then gathered every single piece of evidence. The fake spreadsheets, the real estate deeds we found, the forged loan application, the bank routing numbers, and personally handed them over to an investigator at the State Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. Once the criminal complaint was officially logged, Dave dropped the civil hammer. We formally filed a massive multi-count lawsuit in the state superior court against my sister, my brother-in-law, and their hidden real estate LLC. We sued for fraud in the inducement, severe breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment, intentional misrepresentation, and civil conspiracy. We didn't just mail it. Dave hired a process server. The server handed them the massive 2-inch thick stack of legal documents right in the middle of my nephew's crowded Saturday morning soccer game, in front of all the other suburban parents they constantly tried to impress. The facade was finally publicly cracking. Now, anyone who has ever been involved in a major civil lawsuit knows that the legal process is not fast. It is a slow, grinding, agonizing slog. The discovery phase alone took 14 brutal months. We subpoenaed absolutely everything. Every single bank record dating back 5 years. Every text message between them. Every email to their real estate broker. Every tax return. They fought us at every turn, filing motion after motion to delay. But Dave was relentless. Finally, we reached the deposition phase. I sat quietly in the corner of a long mahogany table in Dave's incredibly intimidating downtown conference room as a court reporter set up her machine. My sister and brother-in-law were sworn in under oath. My brother-in-law looked completely exhausted. The stress had aged him a decade. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his expensive suit looked slightly baggy. My sister, however, looked furious, sitting rigid in her chair, still desperately trying to maintain her posture of victimhood. Dave, who transforms into an absolute shark in a deposition, started with my brother-in-law. For the record, Dave began, his voice calm but sharp, is it true you officially dissolved your logistics startup, the entity my client was funding, in August of 2023? Yes, my brother-in-law muttered, staring at the table. And yet, Dave continued, sliding a piece of paper across the table. You continue to send my client quarterly financial statements detailing severe operating expenses, server costs, and payroll for this completely dissolved entity for an additional 28 months. Is that correct? We pivoted the business model. My brother-in-law stammered, trying to deflect. We transitioned into property management. Dave didn't miss a beat. He slid a massive, thick black binder across the table. It landed with a heavy thud. This binder is a certified record of the bank account where my client deposited exactly $252,000 over 3 years. Dave said, tapping the cover. It shows direct, automated transfers from this account to an LLC registered solely in your wife's name, which then systematically purchased 3 commercial residential properties. Did you at any point inform my client you were using his designated business investment funds to purchase your own personal real estate? He gave us that money to support our family. My sister suddenly exploded, slamming her hand down hard on the table, completely unable to contain herself. He promised to help us when we were struggling. It doesn't matter exactly how we used it. He made a family commitment. He's just trying to steal our properties now because he's jealous. Ma'am, please only answer when asked a direct question by myself or your counsel, Dave said coldly, not even looking at her. He turned his attention back to my sweating brother-in-law. Dave pulled a single sheet of paper from his file. Moving on. Did you, on the 4th of October this year, forge my client's digital signature on a $150,000 home equity line of credit application using his Social Security number? My brother-in-law's defense lawyer immediately put his hand on his client's arm, intervening sharply. He instructed his client to plead the Fifth Amendment to avoid self-incrimination on the record, as he was fully aware the State Bureau of Investigation's criminal probe was now highly active. Watching my brother-in-law repeatedly plead the Fifth to basic questions, watching my sister physically squirm in her leather chair as the undeniable, documented paper trail of their massive deceit was laid out bare in front of a court reporter, was the exact moment the scales finally tipped. They had absolutely nothing. No defense. No leverage. The family narrative couldn't save them in a room governed by facts and perjury laws. The next few months were a systematic, totally legal dismantling of the life they had built entirely on my dime. Their defense lawyer made one last desperate attempt. He tried to argue a defense of promissory estoppel in court, basically claiming that they had structured their entire financial lives and real estate investments around my ongoing promise of $7,000 a month, and that pulling away suddenly caused them undue hardship. Dave destroyed that argument in a single motion hearing. Promissory estoppel requires a reliance on a promise to be reasonable, transparent, and in good faith. You absolutely cannot claim good faith reliance on a contract when you are actively, intentionally defrauding the person making the promise. The judge agreed completely. We didn't even have to go to a full trial. The judge ruled heavily in our favor on a summary judgment regarding the civil fraud and breach of contract. The consequences for them were absolute and devastating. The court ordered a constructive trust over their hidden real estate LLC. In legal terms, this meant the judge formally recognized that the 3 duplex properties were purchased with my stolen, misappropriated funds, and therefore, the equity belonged to me. The judge ordered all 3 properties to be immediately liquidated. The real estate market had dipped slightly in that specific college town due to some zoning changes. By the time the 3 duplexes were forcibly sold, the closing costs were paid, and the massive original commercial mortgages they took out were satisfied. The remaining equity barely covered the $252,000 they legally owed me, let alone the $60,000 of my legal fees and the heavy punitive damages the judge tacked on for the malicious nature of the fraud. But they still owed the remaining balance of the judgment. To satisfy the rest of the massive debt, Dave ruthlessly placed a lien on their primary residence, the 5-bedroom custom build. They couldn't afford their massive monthly mortgage payment without my $7,000 subsidy and the lucrative rental income they just lost. Within 4 months of the summary judgment, they defaulted completely. The bank swooped in and foreclosed on their dream home. The criminal side of things was even worse for my brother-in-law. The state district attorney, presented with an absolutely bulletproof case by the state investigators, aggressively pursued the felony forgery and identity theft charges. Facing very serious, mandatory state prison time if he took it to trial and lost, my brother-in-law completely caved. He took a plea deal roughly 2 years after the initial Sunday lunch incident. He pleaded guilty to felony fraud. He avoided prison time, but he received 5 years of heavily supervised restricted probation, was ordered to complete 1,000 hours of community service, and most importantly, he now carries a permanent, unexpungible felony record for financial fraud. That conviction effectively ended his entire career in finance management or logistics forever. Nobody hires a convicted fraudster to manage money or supply chains. He currently works as an hourly assistant manager at a regional discount tire shop. When the legal dust finally settled, they were completely, utterly broke. Their luxury SUVs were quietly repossessed one night. With the foreclosure on their record and a felony to his name, nobody would rent them a decent apartment. They had to swallow every single ounce of their massive pride and move into my mother and father's unfinished, damp basement. My parents finally, painfully saw the truth when the civil court judgments and the criminal plea deal became public record in the local paper. My father called me a week after they moved into his basement. His voice was shaking, and he sounded like a broken, exhausted man. He apologized profusely for ever doubting me, for taking her side without looking at the evidence. He tried to explain that my sister had manipulated them for years, that they genuinely didn't know the terrifying extent of the lies and the illegal activity until the police got involved. I accepted his apology because he's my father, but the dynamic of the family was forever fundamentally broken. I told my parents very clearly that I would always love them and make sure their medical needs were met as they aged, but I was stepping back. I absolutely refused to attend any future family gatherings, holidays, or lunches where my sister or brother-in-law were present. I actually ran into my sister about a year after everything finalized. She tried to corner me at a local grocery store near my parents' house. I almost didn't recognize her. She looked incredibly haggard, stressed, and exhausted. The expensive clothes were gone. The smug, superior attitude she carried her whole life was entirely, totally erased. "You ruined our lives," she hissed at me venomously, blocking my shopping cart in the produce aisle. "Over money. You literally destroyed your own family because you couldn't stand seeing us succeed." I looked at her for a long moment, casually holding a bag of Honeycrisp apples. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt profound, heavy pity for her. "I didn't destroy anything," I said calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I just stopped paying for the illusion you created." I pushed my cart past her, walked away, paid for my groceries, and drove back to my quiet, peaceful life. I eventually took the recovered funds from the lawsuit and heavily invested them into a brand new commercial retail plaza on the edge of town, which has been highly profitable. I still live in my modest house, and I still proudly drive my 6-year-old dented truck. Looking back on a whole nightmare, the initial betrayal from my own blood hurt worse than anything I've ever experienced. But the absolute clarity I gained was worth every single penny I spent on Dave's legal fees. You simply can't buy genuine respect or love from entitled people, but you can absolutely, certainly stop funding their comfortable lies. If you want to make sure your family doesn't secretly steal your hard-earned cash to build an underground real estate empire while calling you selfish to your face, hit that subscribe button before your next painful Sunday family lunch.